Paleo Runner Podcast is devoted to finding better ways to live, run, train, and eat. I'm your host, Aaron Olson. You can find more information by going to paleorunner.org. If you enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Search for Paleo Runner in iTunes and click Ratings and Reviews. You can also follow me on Facebook.com/RunPaleo or on Twitter @RunPaleo. I wanted to take a minute to let you know about a product I've been using called 3Fuel. 3Fuel is a sports drink that gives you fat, protein, and carbohydrates to use as a fuel source. Unlike sugary sports drinks, 3Fuel gets absorbed slowly into your bloodstream to give you sustained energy throughout your workout. If you'd like to give it a try, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code 3FOLSON. Go to paleorunner.org and click 3Fuel at the top of the page. If you're listening through the podcast app on iPhone, click the link displayed on the app right now. My guest today is Paul Jaminet. Paul is a scientist with a PhD in physics. He has worked as an astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center. He now works as an economist and consultant and has most recently turned his focus to health and nutrition. His book is called The Perfect Health Diet and is authored by he and his wife. His wife is a molecular biologist and cancer researcher at the Harvard Medical School. If you're listening to today's show on an Apple device, you'll be able to find links, chapters, and other information as you follow along with the show. Paul, thanks for being part of the show today. It's great to have you on.
Oh, hi, Aaron. It's great to be with you.
So I know you have kind of a story about how you came to the paleo diet and what kind of health improvements you saw when you first went on it. Can you give our listeners a little bit of background about how you came to the paleo style of eating and what kind of issues you were dealing with and what kind of improvements you saw?
Yeah, well, I had sort of a long history of health problems dating back to birth, actually. My mother was diagnosed with cancer while she was pregnant with me, and basically from the time I was born premature, like 4 pounds, 9 ounces, and I had ear infections, chronic ear infections through my first 4 years of life, and I was in and out of the hospital. As a teenager, I had bad acne, and that stuck around. And in my late 20s, I decided to try and get medical treatment for it. And I had a year-long course of antibiotics, and that really damaged my health. So everything started getting worse while I was on antibiotics. And from that point on, it kept getting worse every year. So I developed rosacea, hypothyroidism. I was running, and while I was on the antibiotics, my running speed slowed down tremendously. But most scary of all, I started developing neurological issues. So, very slow reaction times. I lost my balance easily. I would drop things, fumble things all the time, and I started losing my memory. I couldn't remember people. I couldn't remember facts. I couldn't remember where to find facts, things like that. Mm-hmm. I kept losing things. And so I was getting really worried that, I was coming down with Alzheimer's or MS or something at age 40. So at about age 40, I found the paleo diet, and that had an effect. It wasn't all good, but it was all interesting. And so I started thinking, diet must be really the key to fixing my health, and started working on it. And that's what led us, it's now 7 years later, and we published a book. We pretty thoroughly researched the diet and nutritional biology literature and figured out what we think is the optimal diet. Mm-hmm. And it's not only helped ourselves, but hundreds of people have reported cures of medical conditions. And, so we're very happy with what's come about. And we're very optimistic that our diet can help a lot of people. And the other aspect of it is that our diet really tastes great. So it very much resembles gourmet cuisines. I don't think that's an accident that the healthiest diet tastes great. I think our brain evolved to reward us for doing what's good for us, and that's very gratifying. That you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, be healthy and be happy.
The diet is basically takes the idea of an evolutionary perspective that the diet that's best for humans is the diet that we evolved to eat. And you say that evolutionary perspective shows that we should be eating things like a higher fat diet. I think in your book you said around 55% fat. And people that are runners and stuff, they read Runner's World and it tells them to shy away from saturated fat. But you say it's a benign substance, and I think that brings some confusion. I mean, eating, some people might think, well, I thought we evolved from monkeys. Don't they eat bananas? Wouldn't the vegetarian diet be the healthiest? How can you explain that to people, that saturated fat really is a benign substance that can be used for fuel in the body?
Yeah, well, that's a complex group of questions. So, first dealing with the monkey issues, we have a chapter in our book on mammalian diets and animal diets, and, basically relating those to human diets. So every animal that eats a different diet has a different digestive tract, and every animal needs very similar nourishment. So the function of the digestive tract is to transform different kinds of food into a similar set of nutrients. And we humans really have a very minimal digestive tract, so in our case, it's beneficial to eat a nutrient profile very similar to what our bodies need. And so we can actually look at the nutrient profile that gorillas get after digestion and use that as a template for us. And gorillas and chimpanzees end up getting about 60% of calories from saturated fats just as a result of fermenting fiber. Their diets are extremely fiber-rich, and bacteria in their guts ferment the fiber into saturated fats. So, that's one instance that gives it plausibility. Another one, breast milk and the milk of all mammals is very rich in saturated fat. That's why dairy fats are high in saturated fat. And breast milk, of course, is the perfect food for infants. So those are some evolutionary biology sources of evidence. In general, saturated fat is very good for athletes. It helps create a very good body composition. It is very beneficial for mitochondria and muscle and for energy production. So for explosive power, speed.
Really, even explosive power, because sometimes you hear that, if you want to do sprints or something, you need to eat a high carb diet because there's a glycolytic process that's needed for sprinting. Is that true?
Yes, but there's a difference between performance in competition, peak performance, and training. And so for peak performance, you need to have, particularly if it's over an extended period of time, you need to have your glycogen reservoirs full because glycogen can create the most ATP per unit of oxygen. And so if you're going to be, any event where you're going to be breathing heavy, if you've got your glycogen stores full, then you'll be better able to, get the most out of the oxygen that you're breathing. But that's sort of a performance thing. So you may want to carb load before an event, but that doesn't mean that you want to carb load every day for training.
Right.
What you want to do for training is maximize mitochondrial health, and you also want to become efficient at fat burning. So fat is actually a very good energy source, and burning fat will also help you increase your VO2 max and other things like that, improve your cardiovascular health. So, your goals in training should be a little bit different than your goals in competition.
So are you saying that by just eating more fat, we can basically train our bodies while we're not actively training to burn more fat? Is that the basic idea?
Basically. Right. So what you want to do is eat a balanced diet. So generally that means around half fat by calories with an emphasis towards saturated fat and monounsaturated fat, and maybe 30% carbs, maybe 15% protein. So a strength athlete might want to go more toward 20% protein, but that's the vicinity that you want. And, so that'll support all the body functions, and it'll get your muscles burning fat primarily, except when they have, a need for explosive energy. And so that mix will generally be best, for training. And then you might carb load a little, just before an event, especially if you're an endurance athlete.
So you've given a couple sources of evidence why this diet might be good. You've said that a lot of mammalian animals, actually, they take in a ton of fiber and they turn that into fat. And mother's breast milk is very high in fat, and it's very healthy for the child. What's the importance of lowering the carbohydrates? Is it because of insulin, or is it because our ancestors, since they ate a higher fat and less carb, that's what we should do?
Well, I think it's more what you really want is you want your food to nourish your body.
Mm-hmm.
So think about it this way. The way cells are designed, they have certain structural components. They have lipid membranes composed mainly of fat.
Mm-hmm.
They have proteins which are flowed in their cytosol and water and also thread their membranes. They have carbohydrates that bond with the proteins and also are very important for the extracellular matrix that cells build around them. And you also have electrolytes, minerals that are floating in the water. And what happens when you fast is that cells cannibalize themselves. So they pull fats off the membrane and burn them. They consume protein and they shrink in size. And then when you eat a meal, what the cells want to do is pull nutrients from the blood that you got from the meal and use them to rebuild themselves to their proper size.
Mm-hmm.
So you shouldn't think of what you eat as providing things that are going to be burned for energy. You should think about what you eat as things that are going to be incorporated into cells.
Okay.
And that's the healthiest way to eat. And your cells can only incorporate so much carbohydrate or into their structure. So cells have a very well-defined structure and it's minority carbohydrate.
Okay.
And so when you eat extra carbohydrate, you're forcing your body to do sort of unnatural things, either to burn extra glucose and to do less self-cannibalization, or convert the glucose to fat, or, but primarily you end up burning extra glucose, and that's not as healthy because it's sort of an emergency mechanism that bypasses the biologically healthy process of self-cannibalization by cells and then reconstruction.
So you're saying that self-cannibalization of cells is a good thing? That sounds kind of bad. Why do you want to cannibalize your cells?
Well, that's how biology works. That's why it's good for us to eat other animals and plants, which also have the same structure of cells, composed of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates.
Okay.
So the very reason that natural living plants and animals are the healthiest food for us is also the reason why it's normal and proper for our bodies to self-cannibalize. And that's why if you're on a healthy diet, you can tolerate fasting very well. So if you're eating a diet that resembles the composition of your cells, then there's really no difference as far as the cell is concerned between whether you're eating or whether you're fasting.
Okay.
The only difference is that while you're fasting, your body is shrinking a little.
Okay.
And while you're eating, your body's growing. But as far as the metabolism, what it's burning for energy, it's exactly the same. And, so one advantage of eating in the pattern of our diet is that it makes fasting very easy. You don't get hungry. You don't miss meals if you're busy that day and you have to skip a few meals. So it happens I've been busy today. It's 2:20 in the afternoon and I still haven't eaten yet.
Wow.
But I feel fine.
Okay. So are fats empty calories, or do they contain any nutrients that would be helpful for things like athletic performance, or is it just strictly a fuel?
No. Everything we eat should be more than a fuel. If it's only a fuel, then you shouldn't eat it. But fats, it's actually, there's a broader technical term called lipids, which encompasses fats plus some other compounds that associate with fats, and many of those are very important nutrients.
Okay.
So key things are the way fats appear in cell membranes is actually as phospholipids, which are two fatty acids combined to a glycerol, which is a kind of carbohydrate, combined to an organic molecule like choline. And choline is an extremely important nutrient. I mentioned carbohydrate as a nutrient we should have in our diet. So that's just one example. Cholesterol is an important nutrient.
Cholesterol is important? I thought that was going to clog our arteries.
No, it is an important nutrient. There was a study in 1974 by a guy named Fred Kummerow, where he fed rats a diet of 100% eggs or 100% egg beaters. And egg beaters were a fake egg that's missing cholesterol and a few other nutrients. And it turns out the rats that ate the eggs were quite healthy. The rats that ate the egg beaters were extremely scrawny and ugly and sickly, and they died at age 8 weeks.
Wow.
So it's there are lots of things in natural fats that we very much need.
Okay, so you're saying it didn't clog the arteries in rats, but there's been some new evidence coming out. I think if people were to go to their doctor and say, I'm going to go on this diet that sounds evolutionarily correct, and it's a higher fat diet, like 55%, their doctor's going to say, whoa, that's no good. You might feel good or something, you might lose weight, but you're going to kill yourself. Can you summarize the latest research on whether fat's going to clog someone's arteries and give them a heart attack or not?
Yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. Actually, it works the opposite way.
Okay.
When you eat fat, then your cells consume fat, and that helps keep your arteries clear of fat. Whereas if you're eating carbohydrates all the time, then your cells are forced to metabolize carbohydrates in order to dispose of these things after meals, and that means they don't do a good job of clearing fats from your arteries.
Okay.
But if someone does have that problem, their doctors are complaining, just recommend our book to the doctors, because a lot of doctors have been convinced by our book. We have a lot of doctors tell us they recommend it to their patients, and we've gotten a lot of emails from people who said, I read your book because my doctor recommended it to me.
Oh, wow. So it is changing slowly.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think we have a very strong scientific case. One thing about our book is we explain all the reasons for every recommendation.
Right.
And it is a compelling case. And we also have hundreds of reader success stories. So, and it's not an extreme diet. It's not like an extreme low carb diet. It's not a low plant food diet. And, so I think doctors feel comfortable recommending it.
Yeah, when you said that as you're eating more fat, that it allows your body to clear more fat because it's burning it. I noticed that when I went on this style of diet, I had my blood checked, and my triglycerides on a typical American diet, which was high carb. I was a runner. I thought I ate healthy. I am a runner still, but they were around 80 to 90. And when I went on the higher fat paleo style diet, my triglycerides dropped to like 47, and my HDL went up, which is the good cholesterol, or I don't know what they call it now, but it's supposedly associated with less cardiovascular disease. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's a universal experience. It's basically lower carbs to 30%, and replace the missing carbs with fat, and your triglycerides will go down because fat clearance from the blood has increased, and HDL will go up. So basically everyone who eats 30% carbs or less will end up with pretty much picture perfect triglycerides and HDL.
Okay. Now, you're an economist or economic consultant and a physicist. How is thinking about complex issues similar to health and nutrition? Can you take some of those skills and apply them to nutrition, or is it a totally different paradigm that you have to use?
Yeah, I think it's similar. I think, I would say, my physics background is helpful in terms of scientific rigor and just, being careful, simple things like crediting all your sources and, being careful about, what things say. It leads you to do more careful thinking, more careful work. Easier to check whether something you assumed is true really is true. And sometimes when you sit down to write, you believe something is true, but then you try to find evidence for it, and you find there isn't evidence for it, and you have to change your mind. And so that happened to us a number of times while we were writing the original draft of the book.
Okay.
And then economics, I think, is really close to diet and biology. So in the original edition of our book, I talked about how the cooperation of people and other goods in an economy is very similar to how molecules and cells, nutrients, cooperate to build a healthy body. And there really is an intimate level of cooperation between everything in your body. And so having a background in economics really helps to understand biology. And it helps avoid some mistakes that you commonly see.
Yeah, and I think in your book you showed like a Gaussian peak where you have certain nutrients that are helpful up to a point, and then as you consume more and more of them, they get less and less helpful. And I think, isn't that similar in economics where you have margins on either side, and a certain way of doing things is going to be helpful up to a point, but then as you do more of it, is there similarity there?
Right, that's right. So in economics, you have this concept of diminishing marginal utility. So the more you get of something, the less valuable it is to you.
Okay.
So for instance, if you didn't have any paper, then you wouldn't be able to write things. So getting more paper would be valuable. At some point, you have a great amount of paper, and you don't need or want any more. And if you kept getting more, it would start to crowd your house, and if it filled every room, you might not be able to go in, and so it would be a negative for you. And so it's similar with nutrients. They do you some good in small doses, and the more you get, the less good each additional bit does you. And at some point, you reach an optimum where you've fulfilled all the beneficial uses of the nutrient, and as you get an excess, then it starts to do you harm. And so it's quite, the reasoning is quite similar in biology as it is to economics.
Okay. One thing I like about the evolutionary approach versus what I kind of think of as like a more modern scientific approach is a scientist can do a study on a few thousand people and show that there's no harmful effect. But if we look to an evolutionary perspective, Mother Nature has already done thousands or millions of studies and deleted most of the bad things and kept the things that worked. So you could do a scientific study that shows that statins have no consequence, but an evolutionary approach seems to be a little bit more prudent versus some of the modern approaches. I mean, another thing that I think about with running is modern running shoes have become so cushioned and built up that some people are now saying that they might be contributing to injury, and we're going back to more of a minimal type shoe. A lot of people have tried that and found good success. So I think that's really a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. In both respects. So I run in Vibrams myself.
Okay.
You're exactly right as far as diet. So evolution, it really wanted to optimize our health, and so in many ways it shows us just what the optimal diet is. And the parameter space in diet is so huge that it's just not possible for scientists to test every possibility. And plus there are confounders. So there are lots of other things besides diet that affect health. And often, things like how much exercise do people get? Do they smoke? Do they get sunlight? Those things are, what's their income? Those things are connected to how healthy they are, but they also correlate with what foods they eat. And, so it's hard to tell what's affecting people's health, their food or their income or their exercise or their smoking or their sunlight. So, it's just very difficult for conventional approaches that aren't informed by biology, especially evolutionary biology, to figure out what the optimal diet is.
Yeah. And when you're writing your book, how do you separate correlation from causation? I mean, there were some times where I was reading your book, and I think one example was elderly people, they get out of their circadian rhythm, and that's the main reason why they suffer ill health. And I was thinking to myself, can you really separate that and say that that's causation? And how do you do that in your own mind as you're writing and looking at studies of, just because it's raining outside and people are carrying their umbrellas doesn't mean that the umbrellas cause the rain. So how do you go about that?
Well, it's not always perfect, so not every bit of knowledge or advice that we give in the book is completely 100% secure. But it all has an evidentiary basis. So, we present the evidence. In some cases, the direction of causality is, one direction is more plausible than the other. So if there's an association between sun exposure and good health, it probably does run both ways. People who are unhealthy are less likely to go outdoors. They may, sit around indoors more. But people who go outdoors, the sun exposure will tend to make them more healthy. One way to check that is to look over time. If people who are similarly healthy at one point, one is going outdoors, the other one is not, which one is more likely to be unhealthy 10 years later. And studies like that have been done. Those are called prospective cohort studies. And then, when we look at long-lived populations around the world and centenarians, we find that circadian rhythm factors like going outdoors and getting exercise and fasting, intermittent fasting, and so on are really huge factors in longevity.
Okay.
To such an extent that it's almost hard to detect the influence of diet in a lot of centenarian studies. And all of those things, like sleep loss, like exercise versus inactivity, they all have huge impacts on health. It's comparable to smoking versus not smoking. It's around, 6 years of lifespan.
What about confirmation bias? I heard in one interview that, as you started looking more and more into your diet, everything started to fit together. And I was thinking to myself, what kind of intellectual self-defense do you have against just confirming your biases and really thinking through things as to whether, is this diet really helping, or is it helping because I want it to help, and things like that. I've seen huge improvements in my health, but sometimes I wonder how much that's due to the diet, or is it due to my own preconceived bias?
Yeah, well, those biases and prejudices are powerful. So in my case, when I started paleo, I really wanted to believe in the very low carb story. I think some of that is a kind of vanity. That I wanted to be doing something odd so that I could be right and everyone else could be wrong. And so being very low carb was one way to achieve that. And, so it took me a while to come around to realizing that the evidence showed that, eating a more normal amount of carbs, like a 30% carb diet, is actually the most healthful diet.
Okay.
And, so my thinking, did have to change based on the evidence. I think one way to avoid those biases is to try to write a diet book in which you clearly spell out your logic and find evidence supporting every point in your logical arguments, which is what we tried to do. And, so that really tests the quality of your reasoning. And, if your ideas are driven by assumptions and bias, then you'll find a hard time finding logic and evidential support for your ideas. I'm not advising that everybody do. It took us years to write our book, so yeah. I'm not advising that everybody do that, but I think that's one way to help correct your biases.
Okay. Well, let's get on to a little bit more about your diet. There's a few things about your diet that are a little bit different than other Paleolithic style diets, and a couple of things that you include in your diet are white potatoes and white rice. Now, I've been reading Runner's World for years, and the nutritionists in there always say you want to stay away from the white stuff, stay away from the white potatoes, the white rice, the white flour. Why are you telling us that those might be healthy things to include in our diet?
Well, I think first of all, that the basis for that conventional advice is really based on the observation that eating natural whole foods is healthier than eating refined, purified foods. So things made with wheat flour like cookies and crackers and donuts aren't as healthy as, whole food diets, even if they're whole grain diets. But white rice and white potatoes are natural whole foods. So it's actually, it's a mistake to blame the color white for the unhealthfulness of foods. It's actually the artificial, refined, purified, industrial composed foods that are not healthy, not the white foods.
Okay.
So that would be my primary answer. And in terms of white rice and white potatoes, we want people to eat some carbohydrates, and we think those are among the healthiest sources because they're extremely low in toxicity. And they're also nourishing. So the most desirable form of carbohydrate for us is glucose. So something like fructose is less helpful to us, and so it's good for us to get a fair amount of starches, which provide glucose without fructose. And white rice and white potatoes are among the healthiest, lowest toxicity sources of starch.
Okay. So you mentioned white rice, and a lot of people might be thinking, why not brown rice? Why not whole grains to fill that 30% carbohydrate? What can you explain some of the anti-nutrients or toxins that might be found in whole grains and brown rice?
Yeah, well, in general, grains are some of the most toxin-rich foods, and the reason is because they grow on grasslands where they co-evolved with herbivorous mammals like cows and horses. And so the cereal grains were constantly being eaten by mammals, and they didn't want the digestive tracts of mammals to destroy them so that they couldn't destroy the seeds so that they couldn't reproduce and form a new wheat plant. What they would much rather want is for the seeds to survive intact and come out the other end of the cow or horse with a bunch of manure to fertilize a new plant. And so the way they did that was they put into the shell, which is basically the bran, a bunch of proteins that would sabotage mammalian digestion. And so those proteins are basically toxic to us, and they work in us as well as in horses and cows. In fact, they work even more so in us because we don't have the evolved digestive mechanisms that cows and horses do. And so we're vulnerable to those toxins, and the best thing is not to eat them. And so we're actually better off not eating the bran. And those toxins in most grains, they survive cooking, but that's not the case in white rice. So in white rice, they're destroyed in ordinary routine cooking.
Okay.
And so that's what makes white rice safer than other grains.
How about the saponins that are found in white potatoes? First of all, are those in just white potatoes, or are they also found in sweet potatoes? I know a lot of Paleolithic style eaters will gravitate towards sweet potatoes, but are those toxins, the saponins, something we need to worry about?
Yeah, they are something to worry about, but the levels are highly variable. So, potatoes in their natural state, if they're not threatened by anything, generally don't produce large quantities of these, and so they're not dangerous to humans. But if they're exposed to heat, to moisture, to bright light, if their skins are penetrated, by bugs or something like that, then they'll generate these toxic compounds as defenses. And but the toxins tend to be concentrated close to the skin. So if you peel potatoes, that will reduce toxicity. But the most important thing is to handle them properly. Don't expose them to light. Keep them in cool, dry conditions, but not too cold. And basically, the best way to manage potatoes is to store them well until you cook them, cook them reasonably quickly. And then you might want to, do something like boil them and then dice them before you eat them and look for any discolored areas and cut away the discoloration.
Okay, so in my case, I shared with you earlier before we started recording that, I had a lot of digestive issues, and when I would run, it would really affect me, especially on the longer runs. Do you think that the reason the paleo diet helped for someone like me is because I eliminated grains and some of those toxins could have been disrupting my digestive tract?
Yeah, I think that's very possible. Lots of people recover from digestive tract issues when they give up grains, especially wheat. There's lots of other things that can affect it. So things like sugar, things like omega-6 fats from vegetable oil. Both of those tend to generate gut dysbiosis and problems. And there are other sources of toxicity. There's malnutrition, the wrong forms of fiber. So we evolved for certain forms of fiber, mainly resistant starch from starches like potatoes, and soluble fibers from fruits and vegetables, things like that. And, so the type... And we also evolved for eating a lot of foods with antimicrobial compounds. So, for instance, a lot of plants are threatened by fungi in the wild, so they make antifungal compounds. And, we, in our ancestral diet, we ate a lot of vegetables and root vegetables that have a lot of those compounds. And so that helps shape the flora of the digestive tract in a beneficial way. And, so we basically co-evolved with gut bacteria, and if you eat the correct diet, then you're much more likely to have a good mix of gut bacteria. Whereas if you're eating a diet of like cookies and crackers and cakes and donuts, made of refined flour and sugar and vegetable seed oils and things like that, then the odds are your gut flora is gonna be a little problematic.
Okay. You mentioned sugar in there, and for me, that was one of the hardest things to give up as I went towards the paleo style of eating. I mean, it's in Gatorade, it's in the sports drinks that we take during marathons, and chocolate is so good. Is there any amount of sugar that's okay to have? I mean, say I go out for a 20-mile run, and I have some Gatorade during the run. Or I come home, like I think last week I made some date balls with dates and nuts and then coated them in a dark chocolate. Do you exclude all sugar, or is there some amount that's okay?
No, we basically recommend excluding added sugar, but getting sugar from natural plant foods like say beets, carrots, fruits, berries, and then if you want added sweeteners, you can do some mix of dextrose, something that's pure glucose like dextrose powder or tapioca syrup, those type of things. Maybe with a little bit of something that has fructose like honey. But basically added sugar should be a very small part of your diet, and athletes are probably the exception who can have, who will best tolerate sugar because, the exercise is depleting glycogen from your liver especially, and the fructose that you eat goes straight to your liver and helps replenish glycogen. And, whereas somebody who's not exercising and is eating a high carb diet, they really don't have any free glycogen. And so when they eat fructose, it's malabsorbed. The body doesn't want it. It goes to gut bacteria and it causes gut dysbiosis and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and conditions like that. So athletes can tolerate, more sugar than ordinary people, but you still don't want to overdo it.
I wanted to ask you about dairy products, because a lot of the paleo-style eating says, wild animals weren't meant to be milked, but you say, actually dairy products are okay. Lauren Cordain seems to link dairy to acne and things like zinc malabsorption. He also, in his latest book, says that there's things like steroids and growth hormones and bioactive peptides in dairy. Are those true claims, and what is it about dairy that you think is advantageous to include in the diet?
Yeah, well, many of those claims are valid. So, I wouldn't say that, cow's milk is the perfect food for calves, but it's not the perfect food for adult humans. So that's a valid point that, we can probably do better in our diet than drinking cow's milk. But there are a lot of things to like about dairy, so the fats are really good for us. It's really a terrific mix of fatty acids and cholesterol and things like that. So things like butter are very good. And in general, fermentation of dairy removes a lot of the, harmful, potentially risky compounds. So things like yogurt and cheese have a lot of good points. So we basically recommend, including fatty and fermented dairy in your diet, unless you're sensitive to dairy. And we don't recommend drinking milk. So, I think dairy is kind of a judgment call. It may not be a perfect food, but it's a very good food. It's also inexpensive and it can be very pleasurable too. So, it's good to have homemade ice cream. It's good to have cheese. Fermented foods are generally good. They're a good source of vitamin K2 and vitamin B12 and things like that. And so some aged cheese is really quite good for you.
Okay. One thing I found about eating this way is that you say it's a really delicious diet, and I found that too. And one of my favorite snacks or things to have, not really a snack, but something that I'll eat, is bacon. And you even mentioned in the book that bacon is okay to eat for breakfast, bacon and eggs. And can you go into that a little? Does bacon really, is that a nutritious food that we can eat for breakfast?
Well, I wouldn't say that bacon is terribly nutritious, but there's nothing wrong with it as long as it's been cooked well enough. Sometimes pigs can get infections that are dangerous to humans, like hepatitis E virus, and so you do want to cook pork products reasonably well. You don't want to cook bacon to a crisp, because that generates toxins as well. But you do want to get it appropriately warm, but in general, I think, there's no reason for bacon to be an unhealthy food as long as it's not, dominating your diet and crowding out other, nutrients that you need.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on time here, and there's so many things that I'd love to talk to you about, but I know you've got to get going in a few minutes. What do you say for a practical approach? People might be listening and they say, I want to burn more fat. I want to lower my triglycerides, raise my HDL. They might think that the diet sounds very compelling. And what do you say to people who say, I just can't give up grains. I wouldn't know what to eat. How do you get started do you just throw everything out of your pantry, or can you do it gradually?
Well, you can always do it gradually because, you don't have to be 100% on a diet from the first day. We really want this to be a life change, something you do for the rest of your life, and people have to figure out how to incorporate it into their lifestyle and so on. I would say some of the keys are, getting rid of the bad things like vegetable seed oils, wheat, and sugar. A good basic meal structure. We have a Perfect Health Diet food plate on our website at perfecthealthdiet.com. You should check that out. It's in the shape of an apple with a yin-yang symbol in the apple, symbolizing balance between plant and animal foods. And a good recipe for a meal is sort of equal parts meat, fish, or eggs on one side, a safe starch on the other, and a sugary plant and vegetable on the other. So, sort of 2/3 or 3/4 plant foods, 1/4 to 1/3 animal food on the plate. And basically people should follow their sense of taste toward delicious meals. So in thinking about how much fat, like how much butter or sour cream should you put on a potato, try to make it as tasty as possible.
Okay.
And that will be a good guide to its healthfulness. And, so if you're using good ingredients, natural whole foods, if you're following the rough proportions of our diet and you're trying to make everything delicious, then things will work out great for you.
Okay. And one last question I wanted to ask you was, you're highly successful and you wrote a great book. How do you manage your creative process as you're going through this? And your book has like over 1,000 sources. First of all, how do you manage all those? And what is your process as you're writing your book? Do thoughts come to you, or are you on PubMed all the time researching? How do you manage all that?
Well, remember, this was a 7-year process. It was, and the first 5 years were devoted to fixing our own health problems, and then the next 2 years were devoting to helping our readers who came to us with health problems of their own. So it's really been an ongoing process of research, and it's really driven by curiosity. I wonder how the body works, or how much of this nutrient do we need? How much is optimal? When does it start becoming dangerous? And so it's just following, curious questions like that. So we were led from paleo toward a much broader ranging evolutionary biology investigation. What does evolution really tell us about the healthy diet, and are there, more sources of evolutionary evidence? And then partly based on my economics perspective, toward a nutrient toxin view, which also led us into the biology literature. So my wife is a biologist, so that was a natural perspective for us. Mm-hmm. And, so we thought about how to optimize the amounts of every nutrient that we take in. So we were really thinking for the most part at a nutrient level, and then once we know what nutrients we need, working back to what foods are good for us. So it really wasn't a food-based approach. It was more, nutritional and biological-oriented approach. And I think we ended up back at a very delicious combination of foods. But I think that turned out to be a much more effective way of figuring out the healthiest diet, than the approaches that dietitians and dietary scientists have taken. You can call it luck, you can call it chance, serendipity, but we were just led along a path, and it just happened to end in a fruitful place.
Wow. Well, Paul, thanks for being part of Paleo Runner podcast. It's been great having you on. And there's a lot in your book that we didn't get to. People, if they want to pick up your book, they can find a link at my website. They can find the show on iTunes and follow me on Twitter. But the basic place to go to is paleorunner.org. So, Paul, thanks so much for writing your book. It's a very interesting read, and thanks for being part of this podcast.
All right. Thank you, Aaron.
You've been listening to another episode of Paleo Runner Podcast. For more information, go to paleorunner.org. Thanks for listening.